Today's webinar is on responding to harmful algal blooms, optimization guidelines, and sampling for utilities. Before I get started, just to point out, you've seen on the screen here, there is support for the webinar if you have any issues. We do have a chat box and a questions box, so if you have any issues there, just let us know and we'll try to resolve those there. And also, if you see on your navigation bar that you have on the handouts, we do have one handout if you did not receive the slides in an email. They are available there in a PDF. Okay, and then also, sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time advancing. Okay, so for certificates today, if you're interested in receiving a continuing education certificate for 1 hour, you must attend for 60 minutes. To receive that certificate. So if you did not mark yes when you registered, if you want to just let us know that you would like one of those, you could send an email to the address here, which is available in the handouts and the PDF. And if there are people in the room attending with you who would also like a certificate, you can just email the names of the people in the room with you to this email address, and they can also receive certificates. Okay, so our first presenter is going to be Nick Dugan from the Office of Research and Development, and that's US EPA's Office of Research and Development. Nick is an environmental engineer specializing in drinking water treatment. And our second presenter today will be Heather Raymond. Heather is the HABs coordinator with Ohio EPA's Division of Drinking and Groundwaters. And what we'll do is Nick will start with his presentation, and then Heather will give her presentation, and then we will have the optional Q&A session starting at 3 o'clock. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Nick get started, and we'll switch to Nick. Okay, Nick, and it looks good.
So I'm going to be speaking about the optimization of drinking water treatment when there is a harmful algal bloom. And the presentation is going to be, let me page down.
Sorry about that. We'll get that.
Sorry about that. So let's move on to how the presentation is going to be organized. And we're going to spend some time on introduction and definitions. And then we're going to spend some time going into background. And we're going to be talking about cyanobacteria, and we're going to be talking about their pigments and their toxins, and we'll be talking about how to analyze for their pigments and toxins. And the reason that we're going to be spending some time with this, the reason that we'll be spending some time with this is that a good physical intuition about how pigments and toxins are analyzed for is fundamental to making good treatment decisions down the line. And then when we move into, then the final part of the presentation is going to be, we'll focus on the treatment. And when we talk about the treatment, we're going to focus on aspects of the conventional treatment process, and we're going to focus, when we talk about the toxins, we'll be focusing on removal of microsystems. So let's start with the very basics and what exactly is a bloom. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to define a bloom as a sudden increase in the rate of growth or accumulation of phototrophic microorganisms. And the phototrophic microorganism is a microorganism that depends on light from the sun as its primary energy source. And in the group of phototrophic microorganisms, this group includes algae, which are single-celled organisms which contain a nucleus, and they are part of the kingdom of eukaryotes. And then we also have cyanobacteria, and these are actual bacteria, and they do not contain a nucleus, and they come from the kingdom of the prokaryotes. Why is a bloom potentially harmful? These blooms, they can be unpleasant in appearance, they can generate unpleasant tastes and odors, they can generate negative impacts in the aquatic food web, and some species of cyanobacteria are capable of producing toxins that can negatively affect various systems in the human body, including the liver and the central nervous system. And when there's a bloom present, that can lead to pretty significant loss of confidence in the quality of treated drinking water, and that's something that we all want to work really hard to prevent. So if the blooms that we're worried about are caused by cyanobacteria, why are we calling them harmful algal blooms? And part of the reasons are historical. Originally, cyanobacteria were classified as part of the algae group, and they were classified as blue-green algae. And even in current practice at conferences and in articles and what have you, terms such as cyanobacteria and blue-greens, they're still used interchangeably, so there's a fair amount of confusion. And finally, one of the reasons, too, is it comes down to, frankly, a matter of syllables. The word algal has 2 syllables, and the word cyanobacteria has 7 syllables. And words like, expressions like harmful algal blooms and HABs, they just roll off the tongue a lot more easily than harmful cyanobacterial blooms. So for the purposes of this presentation, we'll be using harmful algal blooms or HABs. So from a drinking water treatment point of view, and especially for a lot of small systems, HABs are a relatively new concern for operators of small systems who are used to managing things like filter effluent turbidities, distribution system chlorine residuals, storage tank levels, lead and copper rule compliance, what have you. And some harmful algal blooms or HABs, they are accompanied by taste and odor events. And the issue there is that historically, when you go to T&O training, things like 2-methyl-isoborneol and geosmin are discussed, but no one, typically historically, these types of training events have not discussed HABs-related toxins. And toxins is really where kind of the complication, it's really the complicating factor in all of this, because these toxins generate mammalian health effects, and the very word toxins carries a lot of emotional freight. And on top of that, operators who are really pretty good at sampling for a lot of other regulated constituents, and and they know which labs are good at carrying out the analyses and who to contract with. Sampling for toxins and contracting for toxin analyses is kind of new territory. And on top of that, events around your water supply that may have passed without a whole lot of attention in prior years, they can take on new potential significance. And that includes questions like, my dog swam the lake and now he's sick. Is it safe to drink the water? Or, hey, the water's green and I found some dead birds on the shore on my walk this morning. Can we drink the water? And so in order to start getting us to a point where, we feel comfortable with these questions, we feel confident in our treatment supply and our water supply and how we're treating it, let's move into some of the background about, cyanobacteria. And we're going to start with this picture of the cyanobacterial cell. And on a really fundamental level, cyanobacteria are microorganisms which take energy from the sun, and they use that energy to fix dissolved carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the water, and they use that carbon dioxide to synthesize a range of complex organic compounds. And these organic compounds include other toxins and their pigments. Now, not all cyanobacteria will produce toxins, and even in those cyanobacteria that do produce toxins, the timing of the toxin production can vary. And when these toxins are produced, they're usually contained inside the cell membrane. However, sometimes toxins are released from cells in the solution. From a water treatment perspective, and we'll get into this again later, it's much easier. Things are a lot easier if toxins are actually, if the toxins stay contained within the cell membrane. Also, if you look in the upper right-hand corner of the slide, all cyanobacteria contain pigments, and 2 of the major pigments are chlorophyll and phycocyanin. In chlorophyll, and specifically chlorophyll A and phycocyanin, are pigments. They're large molecules, and these molecules do a couple of things. They give their cyanobacteria their distinctive color, and they're also essential components of a mechanism that harvests light and converts it to a form of energy that the cyanobacteria can use for growth and maintenance. Now, both algae and cyanobacteria contain chlorophyll, but only cyanobacteria contain phycocyanin. And this difference in the pigment content is one of the things that's really helpful when you need to diagnose the composition of a bloom. So one of the things that these pigments do is that they all absorb light at short wavelengths and they re-emit the light at long wavelengths. And this process is called fluorescence. And the fluorescence of these pigments is something that, that you can take advantage of in order to get a feeling for what the concentration of cyanobacterial cells is in your water source, in your intake, and through your treatment process. And if we look at the bar down at the bottom, and we look first at chlorophyll A absorption, chlorophyll A absorbs light at about 430 nanometers, and then it has an emission peak close to 700 nanometers. And 5-cyanin, on the other hand, absorbs light. It has an absorbance peak at about 620 nanometers, and it emits at about 660 nanometers. And there is a large range of commercially available probes and monitors and handheld and benchtop units. And these instruments use a combination of lamps, light-emitting diodes, and optical fibers to take advantage, optical filters, sorry, to take advantage of these excitation and emission wavelength combinations to generate estimates of algal or cyanobacterial biomass in suspension without actually, without a whole lot of additional sample processing. And this process of using these types of probes without doing any additional processing, just using the water sample, we're going to call it in vivo analysis. And these methods are available for both 5-cyanin and for chlorophyll A. There's also another method called extractive or in vitro analysis for chlorophyll. And this is a process where we filter a known volume of sample, and these cells are retained on the filter. And then this filter and the cells are disrupted, and you then extract the contents into an organic solvent. And then that organic solvent with the chlorophyll in it is analyzed on a benchtop instrument. And then that result is compared against calibration standards, and that process yields an actual quantitative estimate of how much chlorophyll was in suspension, was contained in the cells that were in suspension and retained on the filter. So just to summarize, so we have the sensors, probes, and handheld and benchtop units. They're available for 5-cyanin and for chlorophyll A. The advantages are that they're rapid, very little training is required, and you can sample at a very high frequency. The disadvantage is that there's no direct quantitation of the pigments. Now the in vitro analysis, the extractive analysis, is available for chlorophyll A, and that's EPA method 445.0. And the advantages are that the method is extremely sensitive, has a very large dynamic range, and the analysis is based on material retained on a filter. And so it ends up being a really good proxy for suspended phototrophic biomass. And it's something that's going to be very useful to diagnosing what's going on, how well your treatment facility is performing. The disadvantage of this method is that it does require a higher level of training. Just a quick background, moving into toxins, and here's a quick background of kind of the three major types of toxins, three of the major types of toxins. We have microcystin, which is one that affects the liver. We have cylindrospermopsin, which can affect the kidneys and the liver. We have antitoxin, which is a central nervous system toxin. Moving on, there's two major methods of toxin analyses, and the first one that we'll go into is the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, or ELISA assay. And there's a lot of different details and variations to ELISA assay, but what I've tried to do here is try to bring it down, to distill it down to kind of the basic concepts, so that when you go and talk to a lab, you have some idea of what these concepts mean. And if we look at, say, we'll take a toxin molecule, which is the yellow diamond, and then the assay takes advantage of antibodies that are specific in shape to the toxin molecule. And these antibodies attach to the toxin molecule, and this is the part that's the immunosorbent part. And then that toxin and antibody complex, if we move down to the bottom of the slide, is then conjugated with an enzyme, which is the red circle. And this is where we get the enzyme-linked immunosorbent part. Then moving on, that toxin antibody complex, which has been conjugated to an enzyme, is then exposed to a reagent, and the enzyme catalyzes a reaction that results in a color change that is proportional to the toxin concentration. And that's where we get the concept of the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. And that color change, proportional to the concentration, is all taken care of in a 96-well plate. And then from there, that plate is read. It's read in a commercially available plate reader in the lab, and that color change, which is proportional to the toxin concentration, is compared against the calibration curve. And from there, you can back out an estimate of toxin concentration in your sample. Moving on to the other major method that's currently being used to analyze for cyanobacterial toxins is the liquid chromatography with tandem mass spectrometry, or LC tandem mass spec, or LC mass spec, mass spec. And first the sample is run through a chromatography column, and running the sample through a chromatography column separates the constituents as a function of time. And then that chromatography column effluent, where the constituents have been separated as a function of time, is then run through a mass spectrometer, and that mass spectrometer achieves separation by mass and fragmentation pattern. So that combination of separating by time, by mass, and by fragmentation pattern is another way of eventually of backing out the concentration of toxins and toxin congeners in solution. So the ELISA assay is commercially available for total microcystins, for cylinders per mopsin, and for antitoxin. It's less expensive than the LC tandem mass spec, and however, it's not congener specific. LC tandem mass spec analysis is available for cylinders per mopsin, for antitoxin, and for a subset of the microcystin congeners. And the agency has EPA method 544, which is available for a subset of the microcystin congeners in finished water. The downside of the LC mass spec analysis is that it is more expensive than ELISA. Now, both ELISA and LC mass spec can be applied to extracellular and total toxins. And we're defining extracellular toxins as the toxin, as that fraction of the toxin that passes through a filter. So you filter the sample and you analyze the filtrate. Now, the total toxin concentration, we find that by disrupting the cells through some combination, through either freeze-thaw or sonication or both, and then analyzing what results. And understanding the relative amounts of extracellular and total toxins in your influent and how these proportions are changing through the treatment process are critical to making good treatment decisions. And once again, it's a lot easier to treat the water where the majority of the toxins are still contained inside the cell. So let's move on. Let's look at the first stage of treatment, which is the source water and the treatment plant intake. And this slide is from a reservoir in Wyoming that we looked at in the summer of 2015. And let's look first at, let's see, July 21st. And a sample was collected at the boat ramp, and it came back as, by ELISA, as greater than 290 micrograms per liter of total toxins. And so about a week later, we received some follow-up samples that were collected at the swimming beach and at the intake for a small water treatment plant for this area. And the samples at the swimming beach came back at greater than 1.4 microgram per liter of total toxins. And the samples at the drinking water treatment plant intake came back at less than 0.25 microgram per liter. And the takeaway from this is that a toxin detection in your source water, even a very high one, does not necessarily mean that toxins will be detected at the intake of water treatment facility. By the same token, and this is critical, is that a toxin non-detect in the source water does not necessarily mean that toxins will not be detected at the intake. And so what that points to is a need, depending on your physical situation where you're drawing water from, is the need to maintain separate and regular source water and intake monitoring programs. This slide shows the influent to a full-scale water treatment plant in the western basin of Lake Erie that was sampled both during the 2013 and the 2014 bloom seasons. Sampling started in about, during the 2013 bloom season is represented with the dark squares, and the 2014 bloom season is represented with the white squares. We have time on the x-axis, and we have, we're looking at chlorophyll by the extractive method, and so that's where we pass it through a filter and then analyze what was retained on the filter. So once again, this is a proxy for the concentration of cells in suspension, and that chlorophyll is represented as micrograms per liter on the y-axis. And what we can see here is that these toxin concentrations during the 2013 bloom season, the toxin concentrations during our program peaked in September, and 1 year later the toxin concentrations peaked around August. So the take home here is that the exact timing of the bloom peak can change from year to year. And so the message here is that it's something that a regular sampling program is something that can help you really stay on top of what's happening in your reservoir and in your intake. Now, one of the issues that we want to, one variation on the conventional treatment process that's applied at a lot of surface water treatment facilities is the addition of potassium permanganate. And the permanganate is added for a number of different reasons. Some, for example, if you're on the Great Lakes, you may add permanganate in order to control the growth of zebra mussels in your intake structures. And another reason that you use permanganate is to control taste and odor, causing compounds. And what we wanted to point out here is results from some studies that we did in our labs to look at the potential for toxin release when cells are exposed to permanganate. And on this graph, we exposed cells to permanganate at 3 different concentrations, 1, 2.5, and 5 milligrams per liter. And then we looked at the release of extracellular toxin. We compared that toxin release to what was going on in the control jar where no oxidant was applied. And we can see that, so what you're seeing here along the left-hand y-axis is the ratio of oxidant jar toxin concentration to control jar toxin concentration. And the take-home here is that, depending on the situation, you can see a pretty significant release of cyanobacterial toxins from intact cells when permanganate is added. And the degree of that release and the timing and how much of that toxin accumulates is then driven by is then a function of how much oxidant was also in solution. On the next slide, here we're looking at the impact of powdered activated carbon. Powdered activated carbon addition is another variation on the conventional treatment process. A lot of treatment plants add PAC either full-time or seasonally, either to control taste and odors, or also to control seasonal peaks of, say, herbicides or insecticides that come off during the spring runoff. And what we did here is that we ran some in-house trials, and we looked at the impact of powdered activated carbon or PAC addition once toxins have been released in the solution during permanganate addition. And that's summarized on the slide. And we looked at 3 different turbidities, 0.1, 5, and 20 NTU. We looked at 2 different pHs, pH 7 and pH 9. And the left-hand, and then what we're looking at on the left-hand y-axis is the degree of toxin removal once powdered activated carbon is added. The powdered activated carbon dose was 10 milligrams per liter. And what we can see is, for example, let's look at 1 milligram per liter potassium permanganate dose at 0.1 NTU. We can see that at pH 7, PAC addition resulted in about a 30% removal of toxins in solution, while at pH 9, PAC addition resulted in about a 75% removal of toxins in solution. And the take-home here is that at pH 7, we observed an average toxin reduction of 42% upon PAC addition, and an average, and at pH 9, we observed an average toxin reduction of about 76%. So several research groups they've examined the phenomenon, including us, have examined the phenomenon of toxin release upon permanganate addition. And the degree and timing of the observed toxin release and the accumulation, how much accumulated, it varied between studies. And so what the recommendation at this point is awareness and vigilance and preparation. So for your treatment facility, monitor for extracellular and total toxins before and after the point of permanganate addition. Consider if and for how long the permanganate feed can be interrupted. And also consider adding powdered activated carbon or increasing the dose if toxin release is observed. So then that begs a number of other questions. Do you have enough powdered activated carbon on hand? And what is your maximum feasible PAC dose? And that comes down to the capacity for feeding equipment. Think about sludge accumulation. Also think about things like PAC carryover to your filters, which in turn leads to questions about things like head loss development, filter run times, and filter effluent quality. The next slide, we're looking at toxin propagation through a treatment facility. And this is a facility that was sampled. It's a Lake Erie Western Basin treatment facility. It was sampled during the 2014 bloom season. And we have extracellular toxin concentrations in red, and then we have total toxin concentrations in blue. What we can see is that in the treatment plant influent, almost all the toxin, oh, and by the way, these numbers were analyzed by LC10 to mass spec. So we can see that in the treatment plant influent, all the toxin is present as in the intracellular form, but then after the point of permanganate addition, a significant portion, about half the toxin concentration, was present as extracellular toxins. And then we can see a steady decrease in toxin concentration through the treatment facility. In this slide, we're looking at the propagation of cyanobacterial cells through the treatment process. And this is the same Western Basin treatment plant in Lake Erie, and this is during the 2014 bloom season. And all of these samples were analyzed by extractive chlorophyll A. And so what we're looking at are three different cell profiles through the treatment plant collected in May and July, in May of 2014, early July of 2014, and late July of 2014. And what I want to highlight here is how much work is done from the treatment plant influent to the clarifier effluent or filter effluent, to the filter influent / clarifier effluent. And we can see that from the treatment plant intake to the filter influent, we're achieving almost 3 orders of magnitude of suspended cell reduction before we even get to the filters. And approximately half of that was achieved in the clarifiers. And what that points to is that effective coagulation, flocculation, and sedimentation are critical. So for your treatment facility, ask yourself, do I have room to improve my coagulation, flocculation, and sedimentation process? And one of the critical things to think about here is that blooms, when you have them, they're often associated with quiescent water conditions, which means a significant fraction of the influent particulate load may be bloom material. So be aware in this case that the specific gravity of bloom material is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1. It's not terribly dense stuff. And it may be less than 1 if the cyanobacteria in question contain gas vacuoles that regulate the buoyancy. And in this case, because of this low specific gravity, you may have suspended biomass that can potentially reduce the efficiency of your gravity settling process. So at that point, ask yourself, is there potential for improving process efficiency? And is it worth it to consider changes in coagulant dose? And is it worth it to consider changes in the coagulant type or the combination of coagulants and coagulant aids that you're using, at least seasonally? Here, moving from the sedimentation from the coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation to the chlorination process. In this slide, we are summarizing the CT that's necessary to reduce microsystem LR concentration from 10 microgram per liter to 1 microgram per liter. And we're looking at 4 different temperatures, 10, 15, 20, and 25 degrees Celsius. And we're looking at 4 different pHs, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And I'm highlighting data from 25 degrees Celsius, which is a temperature that is more likely to prevail in the summer during the bloom season. And what I want to highlight here is how the CT increases as pH increases. So increasing from pH 7 to pH 8 generates an increase in CT.
Okay, go ahead, Nick. We lost signal for a minute. Okay, go ahead.
Are we back?
Yeah.
Okay, my apologies. So increasing the pH by 1 log from 7 to 8 increases the necessary CT by greater than a factor of 2. Increasing the pH again by 1 log, by another log from 8 to 9, increases the necessary CT by a factor of 3. And then just as a point of comparison, in the upper right-hand quarter of the slide, I'm showing the surface water treatment rule required CT for a 3-log Giardian activation at 1 milligram per liter of chlorine at 25 degrees Celsius. And we're showing data for the CTs for pH 7, 8, and 9.
Martha, I'm sorry to interrupt, Nick. Can you still hear Nick?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. So just as a point of comparison, you can compare the CTs that you need for surface water treatment rule Giardian activation with the CTs that are required for toxin control. Now, some things to think about is that the data in the previous slide were generated using laboratory generated water, and that your treatment plant effluent is going to have a higher background chlorine demand, which means that site-specific CTs to achieve a given amount of degradation may be higher. Another thing to think about is how do you balance your stage 2 DBP rule compliance with microsystem degradation. Do you have room at your treatment facility to increase your chlorine dose if necessary? Also, it's also a good thing to anticipate and think about a distribution system sampling approach in case of an exceedance in your finished water toxin concentration. So, because your toxins are going to degrade with water age as long as the chlorine residual is present, and high toxin levels might be isolated depending on your distribution system hydraulics. And that in turn, depending on if you have some idea how the toxins behave in your distribution system, is something that may also impact your public messaging. So concluding this presentation with just a little bit of strategy, the first thing you need to do is, the first thing that's necessary to do is to understand your available analytical tools and really understand what they can do for you. Then it's important to institute a monitoring program, and that monitoring program should have 3 phases: a source water monitoring program, an intake monitoring program, and through plant monitoring. And I can't emphasize enough how important this through plant monitoring is, because if you're just monitoring your intake and you're monitoring your effluent, at that point your treatment process becomes kind of a black box. And if you start monitoring through your treatment process, it stops being a black box, and it starts being an information source where you can start thinking about, you know, what part of my process can I improve to really optimize my treatment process. And so what aspects of a conventional treatment process can be optimized? The coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation is critical. Pack addition is also a place where pack addition is something that can build a lot of benefits, and it's also important to think about your chlorine dosing. And it's also important to do some contingency planning. Am I capable of dosing pack, or am I capable of dosing extra pack? What's the status of my pre-oxidation unit operation? Can I dose extra chlorine, and have I thought about notifying the public in case there's an issue? So that concludes my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention. And before I finish, I'd like to thank Toby Sanin and Samantha Smith, who contributed to this presentation, and please feel free to contact me either by phone or by email.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Before we get started with Heather, we're going to get her slides loaded up here. I just want to make a couple of announcements really quickly in case people have to get off at 3. Just a reminder, we have the disinfection byproducts, regulatory issues and solutions webinar that was originally scheduled for April, is now scheduled for June 14th. You should have received that invite. And also we have a webinar which we have not put the invite out yet for June 28th on RTCR for small systems. And also an announcement will be going out shortly, hopefully this week or early next week, that we have a date for our small systems annual workshop, drinking water workshop, and that will be the week of August 23rd. So expect an invite for that, and we will also we'll send it to everyone who's on our webinar list, and it will also be on our website. So, and a reminder, if you do have just only more than one person in the room, if you could just let us know in the question box how many people you have attending. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather. Heather, again, is the HABs coordinator for Ohio EPA's Division of Drinking and Groundwaters. And Heather, if you're ready, I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to you.
Unfortunately, I'm not. I'm not seeing any of my slides appearing.
Okay, yeah, we see, we actually see your email. And Martha, is she sharing her screen, or can you tell?
Yes, she is.
Okay. And do you have your, Heather, do you have your presentation open?
No, there was some miscommunication. I thought you would be loading the presentations. I don't have access to it on this computer.
Okay. Martha, could you go ahead and pull those up?
Yes. Actually, Michelle, do you have them on your computer? The PowerPoint?
Okay, 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and why don't we go ahead while we're getting that worked out. I'm going to go ahead and do a few questions for Nick while we're getting Heather's slides loaded. And I'm just going to go on mute for 1 second. Okay, and Martha, we have someone who's going to, Katie and Heather, we'll have your slides pulled up for you, and then you could just let us know when you need to switch slides. We'll get those up in a minute. So as soon as we get those up, we'll start. But I'm going to go ahead, instead of waiting right now, we're going to go ahead and ask Nick a couple questions that had come up. Okay, Nick. Okay, so this is intracellular toxin release similar when chlorine is used as a preoxidant as compared to KMNO?
Yeah, permanganate.
Permanganate, yes.
Yes, so the same, it's possible the same mechanism applies, because the thinking is that these cells will release toxins when they're subjected to oxidative stress.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And Katie, do you have those slides up yet? Okay, Nick, I have, and one more question. It's about the Wyoming example you gave. What type of sample was collected for the bloom sample?
So are we talking about, so the sample was always, the first sample that was collected was a grab sample of, at the boat ramp. And it was a boat ramp sample, and somebody literally dipped a sample container into some bloom material that had been accumulated by the wind in that abatement, and it was put on ice and shipped to our labs.
Okay, thanks, Nick. All right, Martha, if you're ready, you can pull up. Katie has them if you want to. She has Heather's slides ready. Okay, Heather.
Sorry, I went back to my desk so I could run it from my desk, but this will work. I'll have you advance my slides. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today regarding Ohio's experience with harmful algal blooms. And since I switched all my notes, I am a little discombobulated. There we go. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you for, I'm going to start with a brief overview of Ohio's response to HABs and their occurrence in the state. Then I'll cover the importance of source water monitoring, various monitoring techniques, and the benefits and limitations associated with various monitoring methods, including some of those that Nick already introduced. Finally, I hope to have enough time to briefly cover a few case studies on reservoir management and treatment optimization. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. In 2010, Ohio EPA initiated response-based sampling of water systems. Our laboratory also established the ELISA method for microsystems. That year, an inland water system had finished water detections for microsystems, but is below the WHO standards. Ohio EPA worked with our sister agencies at the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Health over the winter of 2010 to develop the State of Ohio HAB response strategy and establish cyanotoxin thresholds for finished drinking water and recreational waters. The strategy was then finalized in early 2011. In 2012, the recreational and public water supply response strategies were updated as separate documents, and in 2013, we experienced our first finished water detection above thresholds at a small Lake Erie public water system, and an advisory was then issued. The incident did not receive much media attention because the system was able to quickly transition to an emergency connection with the neighboring public water system, but that system could not return to its source water for over a week until concentrations decreased. In 2014, we experienced another finished water detention, but this time it was at a large public water system using Lake Erie as a source water. A do not drink advisory was issued, water was trucked in from neighboring areas, and the press coverage was international. Both state and federal legislators called for action. In 2015, Ohio EPA incorporated US EPA's health advisories for microsystems and silindrostrom into our response strategy and held numerous outreach and engagement sessions. We had finished water detections at 5 different public water systems, but all repeat samples were below the newly established thresholds, and thankfully no advisories were issued. This is in part due to the swift response by the public water systems to optimize treatment and quickly reduce their cyanotoxin levels, and I'll cover that in one of the case studies today. Also in 2015, Ohio Senate Bill 1 passed, which set off a chain of events leading to the development of new HAB monitoring and reporting rules. These new rules will go into effect in Ohio tomorrow, which is why we're pretty busy over here right now. The recreation public water system response strategies are also being updated, and we have developed guidance to help assist public water systems with response. Next slide. Our HAB rules are available at the posted link if anyone wants more information. Also, we have online a 30-minute webinar explaining the rules in depth if people would like to have some additional information, since I cannot cover those in depth during this webinar. As a brief overview, the rules require public water systems to conduct routine microsystems monitoring and cyanobacteria screening using qPCR. They establish action levels for microsystems based on US EPA's health advisories, establish triggers for treatment technique requirements, and specify public notification and CCR requirements. One of the most important requirements is the treatment technique, which requires public water systems to consider how to optimize current treatment if a HAB were to occur, and also to consider treatment capability holistically and identify the long-term needs and potential infrastructure improvements that could be necessary. The rules also provide lab certification requirements and analytical techniques. Our total microsystems method is available online at the link at the bottom of the page. Next slide. This is a map of Ohio depicting public water systems with cyanotoxin detections. We sampled 60% of our water systems, and microsystems have been detected in 75% of samples. Saxitoxins have been detected in 35% of source water samples, so that is also a concern. The occurrence for Slinderstrom was less than 1% of all samples. Anatoxin A has also not been detected at an intake sample, but has been detected at low concentrations below our drinking water threshold at beaches. Overall, cyanotoxin occurrence is very widespread throughout the state and occurs in a variety of source waters, from large rivers to small upground reservoirs and to our largest source, Lake Erie. Next slide. This graph shows the number of microsystem detections above the adult health advisory level of 1.6 micrograms per liter in public water system source waters by month. As you can see, microsystems occur year-round in Ohio, but are most often detected at elevated concentrations in the months of May to October. This is a somewhat biased data set, however, since most of our incident response sampling has occurred during the warmer summer months. Some of our water systems have also had their maximum microsystem detection in the cooler off-season months of November and December. Next slide. This is a graph of weekly microsystems concentrations at one of our most HAB-affected public water system intakes. As you can see, microsystem concentrations have increased annually, showing an alarming trend. So the 2010 data is blue, and the more recent 2015 data is in red. I did not update the graph to include the 2016 data, but concentrations at the intake are currently above 170 micrograms per liter, which is higher than it was last spring, so this trend is continuing. Luckily, this public water system has exceptional advanced treatment, including 2-stage ozone and GAC, and microsystems have never been detected in the finished water. Next slide. And you'll have to hit a second time. Thank you. Even though our rules require routine raw water monitoring, we still encourage water systems to consider additional source water monitoring to guide reservoir management strategies and treatment optimization. Phytoplankton, and especially cyanobacterial ID and cell counts, nitrogen and phosphorus monitoring, and other raw water quality monitoring such as pH, DO, temperature, and turbidity can be very helpful. But today I'm going to focus on phycocyanin, which Nick already described, and molecular methods that ID cyanotoxin production genes, and finally a little on cyanotoxin monitoring. Ohio EPA provides up to $30,000 per public water system for equipment and training to help support additional source water monitoring. Next slide. So why is source water monitoring important? Many times severe blooms are not visually apparent or associated with other water quality impacts like taste and odor compounds. This is an image of a severe microcystis bloom on Lake Erie. In the image, average microcystin concentrations at this beach were over 100 micrograms per liter, and microsystems were also detected at area intakes. Luckily, NOAA provides satellite imagery that has been processed to detect the chlorophyll and phycocyanin pigments unique to cyanobacteria. The bloom clearly shows up in the imagery as the red area on the map, which is used by Ohio EPA in public water systems to target sampling and treatment optimization. Next slide. Thanks to the new ULTRI sensor, which was launched this spring, we should have higher resolution imagery soon, which will enable bloom detection on smaller inland lakes like this. This will be made available as part of the federal collaborative Cyan project, of which Ohio EPA is a pilot state. I believe the goal is to make imagery available nationwide starting as early as next year so other states can benefit from this data. Next slide. And this is just an example of a time series showing bloom formation on a single Ohio lake. Ohio is also partnering with NASA to support image collection via planes and drones to help augment the available satellite data and provide data for smaller lakes and rivers. And again, hopefully this can be spread out to other areas and other states and in broader applicability. Next slide. Another very useful tool is multi-parameter data sondes. These sondes can be equipped with multiple sensors, the most valuable for HAB monitoring, again, being the phycocyanin sensor. This data is courtesy Donna Francie at USGS and shows the correlation between phycocyanin and microsystems. In this lake, there's a 0.98 correlation demonstrating the high value of these sensors for useful real-time monitoring. DO and pH also had very good correlations. And you can get the full data set in the USGS Scientific Investigation Report cited on the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a graph of phycocyanin microcystin concentrations at Toledo's intake on Lake Erie following the finished water detection. Again, you can see a good correlation. I should note that phycocyanin concentrations vary based on type of cyanobacteria present, turbidity, and other water quality factors, especially those affecting light availability. These sensors are best used to evaluate trends on a specific source water, and values should not be compared from one water body to another, although trends within one single water body can be useful as long as the sondes are intercalibrated between water systems, and we've done that on Lake Erie. We've also found it best to report data in relative or raw fluorescence units instead of cell counts. The way these work is that cell counts are based on RFUs associated with a pure microcystis culture. So if your lake has a Planktothrix or a mixed cyanobacteria bloom, then the cell counts will not accurately reflect the actual cell counts. So just a couple things to consider when looking at the data. I should also mention that our website includes a link to a list of different phycocyanin sensors that are available on the market right now. Next slide. Another newer tool is cyanobacteria screening using a multiplex qPCR, quantitative polymerase chain reaction. Let's see. The assays are fast, scalable, cost-effective, and the commercial assay Ohio is currently using includes certified reference materials. Ohio is currently developing and validating the method and will begin lab certification in 2017. We'll be using the screening results to target cylindrospomopsin and saxitoxin sampling based on gene detection. Also, if we find a strong correlation between the microcystin gene and microcystins detections, we may be able to reduce the frequency of microcystin monitoring in the future. There's a link to the assay we are currently using if you want additional information. However, rules are not tied to that specific assay, and we have the flexibility to adjust if new methods become established. I should also mention that we are splitting samples with US EPA's Office of Research and Development this summer. They're going to help validate our method, compare our method to other qPCR assays, use advanced techniques to identify the cyanobacteria genes that dominate our sample and potential bacterial groups that could factor into triggers for toxin production, which is a big question still out there. They also are considering running RNA analysis to help determine the triggers for gene expression. Ohio EPA is very excited about this collaboration, and we hope that the data will be useful for others interested in utilizing these newer molecular methods and potentially even develop some national guidance on the use of molecular methods for cyanobacteria screening. Next slide. In addition to being a useful screening tool, molecular assays can be used to help direct reservoir management. In this example, we had a public water system with raw and finished water saxitoxin detections, but luckily the finished water detections remained below our existing threshold. Since all the saxitoxins we detected were extracellular or outside the cell wall, as Nick explained, we were hoping to find sources of saxitoxin and help target algicide application. We sampled many sites within this 3-mile-long in-stream reservoir, And through phytoplankton identification, I determined that there were 10 different cyanobacteria genera located in basically every habitat zone that were capable of saxitoxin production. The phycologist that reviewed these samples actually said, good luck with this one. It was a very complex situation. So we used molecular assays and found the highest concentration of saxitoxin genes in our benthic or rock scrake samples, which is somewhat surprising. We found no saxitoxin or very limited saxitoxin genes in the water column. So this public water system was able to target algicide application using a pelleted algicide and just limit the application to the reservoir, the size of the reservoir and the banks, and this really helped reduce the saxitoxin concentration in the reservoir. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears a bit and discuss analytical methods for microcystin detection. Overall, unfortunately, there's really no perfect method for the detection of total microcystins. This is because there are at least 140 different microcystin variants or congeners. The ADA moiety, which is the red portion or side chain molecule or moiety that's indicated by the number 5 on that diagram, is present in some forms in all of the microcystin variants, but there's significant variability in the amino acids in the Z and X locations, which leads to the 140 different variants. This variability complicates the detection. Next slide, please. Ohio EPA has incorporated the ELISA microcystin ADA method into our rules. It detects total microcystins based on that ADA structure. I should note that not all ELISA methods will detect total microcystins. Assays based on antibodies raised on portions of the microcystins ring or specific variants will not be as cross-reactive for all microcystins. So that is why Ohio EPA is standardized on using the microcystin ADA assay. The method is highly selective, certified under US EPA's ETV program, moderately sensitive, and suitable for both raw, finished water, and treatment-carrying sample analysis. It's quick, relatively inexpensive, does not require a pre-concentration step, and does not require high-end expertise to run. Currently, 28 public water systems in Ohio have received preliminary certification in this method, in addition to several commercial labs. On the downside, the method does not provide a direct measure of the toxin and does not provide concentrations of specific microcystin variants. After the Toledo event, concern was raised over Ohio's use of this method. In response, Ohio EPA decided to conduct a method comparison study to determine if there is an alternate method and if it should be considered. Next slide. We selected, next slide please. We selected HAB-affected sites representing a variety of source waters from rivers to reservoirs and a range of cyanobacteria genera. Multiple samples were collected from select locations to help assess the spatial and temporal variability within source waters, and each sample is analyzed using 5 separate methods. The ELISA MC-ADA method that was previously discussed and 4 methods that I'll quickly go over now. Next slide. Liquid chromatography followed by UV detection, in liquid chromatography followed by UV detection, the chromatography first separates components and then the 238 nanometer wavelength is monitored since microcystins have a UV absorption at that wavelength. This is not a method that Nick had went over. The problem is other components can have similar UV absorptions, making this a non-selective detector. Interference can prevent accurate identification, leading to the potential for both false positives and negatives. It's less expensive than mass spec, but also less sensitive. There's a standard ISO method, but the method also acknowledges some of these limitations. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Liquid chromatography followed by mass spectrometry allows for highly specific identification of components. This is the best method for identifying specific microcystin variants, but it requires the use of microcystin standards. Unfortunately, standards are only currently available for a small subset of variants, approximately 17 standards available out of the 140 variants. MS methods can accurately identify a component in the presence of collating interference, but quantitation can be compromised. This leads to the potential for under or over-reporting of concentrations. Microcystins also have what is termed a weak product ion abundance, so a pre-concentration step is typically necessary, and pre-concentration with microcystins can be tricky since some are hydrophobic and some are hydrophilic, and optimizing your SP for one variant could potentially reduce recovery of another. Solid phase extraction also pre-concentrates NOM, which can act as an interferent. US EPA method 544 is a new standard method that includes robust QA/QC protocols and reduces variability in results between labs, but unfortunately it's currently limited to only 6 variants. The method is also expensive and requires highly skilled analysts and high-end equipment. Next slide. The LC-MS-MS MMPB method detects total microsystems based on detection of the chemically cleaved ADA structure. It's quick, sensitive, utilizes an internal standard, and does not require standards for individual variants. It's suitable for raw water, but has some limitations for finished water. Like ELISA, it does not provide data on individual variants. It also requires an oxidation step. New studies have shown that unlike ELISA, the MMPB method can detect disinfection byproducts, which limits its utility for finished water analysis. And more information is available in the Toxicon article listed at the bottom of the screen. Next slide. The final method I'll cover is the use of LC-UV and LF-MS scans in tandem to independently confirm presence of microsystems. Peaks detected on MS scans that have corresponding peaks on UV chromatograms are potential microsystem variants. If collision energy is introduced, further analysis of product ions typical of microsystems, like the ADA structure which shows up in the bottom under 135, is possible. This method is useful because it can detect microsystem variants without standards. The method is expensive, requires complex data interpretation, and is time-consuming, but it is currently the best method available to detect unknown microsystems. With enough source material, the structure of an unknown microsystem can be determined with NMR and additional methods. Greenwater Labs has been partnering with us, and they have detected several unknown microsystems in Ohio source water samples using this method. Next slide. This graph shows the results of our method comparison. Only the LC-UV method had one false negative, shown in green, and then one slide in the kind of the middle. The LC-UV method also had several false positives for microsystem LF and LW, which are not depicted on this graph, mainly because the reporting lab felt it could not report data that the MS results confirmed were not accurate. Next slide. And this is just a quick example of a UV chromatogram with multiple peaks, but most did not correspond to microsystems based on the MS data. In addition, the MS chromatogram clearly detected microsystem variants that were missed by the UV method. So this just confirmed that there are limitations associated with using the LC-UV independently without running an LC-MS. Next slide. So how did our data relate? This is a graph of total microsystems determined via ELISA, plotted against the total microsystems determined using the MMPB and individual variant analysis. The ELISA and MMPB data had an R-squared of 0.983, which is almost unheard of in environmental data given the variability inherent within a raw water sample. The R-squared for individual variant analysis was 0.87, which is still very good. The literature also often claims that ELISA overreports total microsystems compared to LC-MS-MS, but considering that LC-MS-MS analysis is often limited to only a handful of variants, a more accurate assessment might be that LC-MS-MS underreports total microsystems as compared to both ELISA, MMPB, and the tandem LC-UV-MS scan method. The UV-MS data is not plotted on this graph, but if unknowns were included, they would plot between the individual variant and MMPB lines. Next slide. Here's some of the variant data for 2 of our sites. What is worth noting here is that our Planktethrics lakes are typically dominated by the methylated microsystems, which are not detectable under US EPA method 544. Also, mixed blooms tended to produce more variants than blooms dominated by a single cyanobacteria genera. Next slide. Thank you. Overall, 16 different microsystem variants were detected, and surprisingly, microsystem LR was only detected at 45% of our sites. The demethylated variants were detected at most sites, along with microsystem RR, and this was unexpected. We had hoped that most of our sites would be MC-LR dominated, and that method 544, comparable method, would be an appropriate alternative. But that was not the case, since 91% of our sites had microsystems not detectable via method 544. We also found that LC-UV and PDA methods were prone to interferences, which resulted in both false positives and negatives. We found that new LCMS-MS-MMPB method confirmed the ELISA results, and that LCMS-MS individual variant analysis potentially underreported total microsystems based on both the MMPB data and the LCUV-MS scan data. Next slide. Thousands of finished water samples have been analyzed via the ELISA MC-ADA method in Ohio, and we had only a handful of finished water detections. Given that data, we did not expect to see matrix interferences with commonly used treatment chemicals, but we worked with researchers to further evaluate the potential for matrix effects. This data was recently published and shows that the tolerance of microcystin ADA is safe for various treatment chemicals. I should note the tolerances for all oxidants were determined after the sample was quenched. Our method requires quenching of all samples subjected to an oxidant immediately upon collection. This is not due to a limitation of the assay, but rather the fact that most oxidants can degrade microsystems over time, as some of Nick's data showed. Overall, chemical tolerances were greater than concentrations typically used in a treatment plant, with the exception of carbon. The low tolerance level for carbon was due to the fact that microcystin absorbs onto carbon and not necessarily assay performance. Next slide. USEPA is also conducting ELISA MC-ADA studies as part of method development for potential inclusion in UCMR4. They're looking at storage stability, sample presentation, preservation in containers, and matrix interferences. Ohio EPA has assisted with the matrix studies by providing real-world raw and finished water samples to include in fortified matrix studies and samples with high concentrations of microsystems for use in dilution experiments. USEPA has completed a method validation study, and they're now working on an interlab validation study. They also evaluated the MMPB method and determined that it detects microcystin disinfection byproducts, as mentioned earlier. The good news is that the analysis helped confirm that ELISA microcystin ADA method did not detect the microcystin DVPs, which was a potential concern. It just showed that the MMP method may not be suitable for finished water matrices unless some of those issues can be overcome. Next slide. Next slide, please. Great. I included the slide just to point out that other cyanotoxins do not suffer from the same analytical limitations as microsystems. And for other cyanotoxins, Ohio EPA will use LCMS-MS method to complement ELISA methods following any finished water detection. So some of the things that I've talked about today regarding microsystems do not, like weak product ion abundance and things, do not necessarily apply to a cylindrospermopsin or an anatoxin A. Next slide.
Hi, Heather.
Yes.
Michelle, I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second because we've gone over past 3 o'clock. I'm going to let you continue, but I wanted to let everyone know that if you have to leave, we understand, and you will still receive the certificate for an hour if you have to go now at this point. But I'm going to go ahead, Heather, we'll let you finish your presentation, and then we'll start the Q&A session when you're finished. And if you do have to leave, we will have a recording of this webinar for what you've missed available, and probably within a week or 2 on our website, and we'll send out that link once it's available. Okay, and go ahead, Heather, you can continue.
Great, thank you so much. The last thing I have is just my case study. So I've covered all the method information that I have, and just going on to how we're utilizing some of this information. So next slide, please. In 2015, Lake Erie experienced its largest bloom on record, beating out the previous record for 2011. The bloom was particularly dense around the Lake Erie Islands, which are kind of in the center of that image. We had finished water detections at 5 different public water systems, but thankfully all repeat samples were below the newly established thresholds, and no advisories were issued. This was due to the swift response by water systems to optimize treatment and quickly reduce cyanotoxin levels. I'll go over some of the optimization efforts utilized by one of those systems now. Next slide. This is a relatively small conventional 0.3 MGD plant with a detention time of approximately 3 hours and a wet well detention time of 35 minutes. Water comes in from Lake Erie and enters the wet well where carbon is added. Additional chemicals are added at the rapid mix, and then the water enters 3 Tonka pre-engineered treatment units depicted in the schematic below and shown in the images in the upper right. Next slide. The severe HAB around the islands resulted in a finished water detection of 1.8 micrograms per liter at this system, which is above the US EPA health advisory for adults. Ohio EPA immediately sent a staff person on site to assist with treatment optimization. We also consulted with the good folks at US EPA ORD for additional advice. When we asked the public water system what his carbon dose was, he replied in terms of number of coffee cans per day, so this was a pretty small system. Carbon up until this point was mainly added in small amounts just to assist with taste and odor concerns. We significantly increased the dosage to about 25 pounds per day, again, which we determined by weighing our coffee cans. Since there was an extra feed point into the rapid mix, we worked with the system to quickly engineer an additional temporary pack feed system and fed an additional 25 pounds of pack per day at that location. Additional pack slurry was manually added to the flocculators and to the top of the tube settlers in an extra effort to combat the cyanotoxins. The system did not know what type of pack was being fed. The bags were so old the labels had worn off, so we contacted a neighboring public water system that we knew had a pack that was optimal for cyanotoxin absorption and requested that they share some of their pack to get us through the weekend until a fresh supply could be obtained. Thankfully, our systems are truly wonderful, and most would do about anything to help out their fellow public water systems. So this water system not only provided carbon, but delivered it immediately via the superintendent's personal truck, which involved a ferry crossing to the island. That type of camaraderie is wonderful and shows the benefit of building relationships prior to a crisis. Another quick fix was installing a trash pump into the wet well to promote improved mixing. Prior to installing the pump, we observed that the carbon just slid down the side of the wet well, sinking to the bottom and forming kind of a sludge on the bottom. After the pump was added, the whole basin turned gray, visually demonstrating improved mixing. Since this is a smaller plant, it did not operate 24/7, and when our staff arrived in the morning prior to operations, the basin had a septic smell. We associated this potentially with decaying algae. Prior to starting the plant, all the sludge was removed from the sedimentation chambers, and this process was continued nightly after production ceased. The potassium permanganate feed was decreased by half to less than a part at the intake, and pre-chlorination was also turned off. However, small doses were later added prior to the filters to address some concerns of viable organisms potentially breaking through the filters. Post-chlorine was increased, resulting in an increased chlorine residual, and the public water system temporarily tested decreasing the pH slightly to promote microcystin degradation because chlorine is more effective at lower pHs for microcystin degradation, but there was concern over potential effect of corrosion control objectives, so that practice was discontinued. But it could potentially work at other systems. None of the backwash was recycled during this event. It all went to waste lagoons, and the public water system also attempted to slow flow through the plant as much as possible to increase their contact time. After the event, the public water system purchased jar testing equipment to help them assess chemical feeds during future events and is upgrading the pack feed system, so they're not these island engineering systems that we had in place during the event. Overall, a lot was done in a very short amount of time to help optimize treatment. Next slide. The result was worth it. Microcystins were not detected in repeat samples, and an advisory was not issued. The public water system is also lucky in that source concentrations decreased after the initial detection. But at the last sampling point in this graph, you can see that when source concentrations increased again, the optimized plant was able to effectively eliminate the microcystins and have no further finished water detections. This example illustrates that a lot can be done with a conventional plant if you can respond quickly, but it also shows that conducting a careful analysis of your plant prior to an event will help minimize the potential for cyanotoxin breakthrough. This is one of the reasons why our rules require any public water system that has had a raw water cyanotoxin detection develop a HAB treatment optimization plan. Our hope is that these plans will help plants avoid finished water detections in the future. In addition, if plants have multiple elevated microcystin detections, a general plan is required to determine if existing treatment and reservoir management strategies are sufficient for microcystin removal or if additional capital improvements may be needed. Next slide. And due to time limitations, I think I'm going to skip over the next two slides, but there's information about reservoir management case study that people are welcome to look at and contact me if they have questions regarding. So to summarize, some severe cyanotoxin-producing cyanobacteria blooms are not visually discernible, underscoring the need for routine monitoring. Cyanobacteria can occur year-round, even in colder climates. Each analytical method has limitations and benefits. Current data support use of the ELISA microcystin ADA method for the detection of total microcystins. LCMS-MS individual variant analysis is appropriate for saxitoxin, cylindrospermopsin, Antoxin A, and individual microcystin variants. But it, especially US EPA method 544, may underreport total microcystins. Methods continue to advance, and Ohio EPA will be part of research and development and consider new methods as they become available. Remote sensing and source water monitoring can be used to direct reservoir management strategies and trigger treatment optimization. Treatment optimization can reduce the potential for cyanotoxin breakthrough, especially optimized conventional plants. And we encourage water systems in other states to consider proactive approaches, monitor your source water, evaluate optimization options, and update contingency plans to increase your preparedness for a HAB. Because no one wants to be sitting at a plant at midnight trying to figure out how they can find a trash pump to put it into a wet well the next morning. So with that, I will close. Next slide. And I can respond to any questions.
Okay, thanks, Heather. And sorry about the slide difficulty there, but you did a great job regardless. So, and what I'm going to do is there's quite a few questions for you and Nick, but since you just finished up, I'm going to go ahead and just start with you, if that's okay. Since
Sure.
it's fresh in everyone's mind right now. So we have one. Can you? Sorry, Heather, I got lost there for a second. Can you clarify that that you use ELISA for confirmation of MC detect? Why not LCMS-MS?
Sure, I'd be happy to. As our slides, as some of the data I presented showed, Ohio, for whatever reason, I'm not sure if this is true in other states, has a high occurrence of some of the more unusual microcystin variants. And some of our severe lakes are dominated by microcystin variants that aren't covered by US EPA's method 544. So for example, Grand Lake St. Mary's, which you may have heard of, concentrations there are exceeding 140 micrograms per liter, but there's no LR, and most of the microcystins are the demethylated microcystins. So even though we might have beaches posted, we have potential dog deaths, human illnesses associated with this lake, to say that it was non-detect because method 544 didn't detect those specific variants we didn't think would be protective of human health.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Another question for you. This question is about detecting, have you had any treatment plants detect cyanotoxins in groundwater sources? Any plant, small systems that use groundwater?
Sure, we've done some limited testing at some of our island systems and have not at this point detected microcystins in groundwater.
Okay, and this is a PCR question. Is Ohio EPA considering using digital PCR in addition to qPCR for detection and quantification of cyanobacteria genes?
In all honesty, I'm unaware of digital PCR, but if someone would send us information on it, it's something that we might consider. At this point, we're open to any cyanobacteria screening tool that's going to help us target our sampling for the other cyanotoxins. At this point, we're looking at the commercial qPCR assay that I mentioned.
Okay. And again, in case the person who asked that question, Heather's contact information is on the slides that were distributed if you want to contact her at a later time. And to remind everyone, we do have quite a few questions coming in. If we don't get to all of your questions, I apologize. But again, Nick and Heather's information is available if you would like to contact them later. Heather, I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to ask Nick a couple of questions because this is qPCR related again. If qPCR detects genes of interest from both dead and live microbes, so how do you determine that the cells that are producing the toxins are live, or does that matter in this case?
That matters in like E. coli monitoring, where you need a viable organism to have an impact on human health. But for us, if there's something that maybe they had an algicide was applied, there still could be toxins in the water, even though the cells weren't viable, and that would still be a concern for us, and we would still want to monitor for that. So that is not as much of an issue for us.
Okay, Nick, I'm going to go ahead and move on to you for a couple questions. Did you want to? Sorry about that. We'll be right back here with a question. You want to go to the Wyoming question? Okay. So initially, during the break, after Nick's talk, we had initially had a question about the Wyoming example, and we only got halfway through that question. So we're going to finish that one right now. So the original question was what type of sample was collected, and the second half was what type or volumes of samples were collected for the other two sites, and what toxin was analyzed.
So, so the sample was blue material taken directly from the surface, or an inch or two below the surface. It was not an integrated depth sample. The sample volume was 250 milliliters, and we analyzed for total microcystins by ELISA, and then we also analyzed for a subset of individual microcystin congeners by LC tandem mass spec.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So let's okay, so the next question is, the LC-MS-MS is only appropriate for finished water? That's a question. I believe that's what's indicated in one of the earlier slides. Is that true?
Go ahead, Heather.
Oh, no, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was just going to say, I went back and looked at that slide, and what the LC tandem mass spec assay can be applied to either finished water or source water, but currently the only official EPA method that the EPA only has an official LC tandem mass spec method available for finished drinking water for a subset of microcystin congeners. There is currently no EPA LC tandem mass spec method available for source water.
Okay. Okay, Nick, is chlorine at the end of treatment proposed to remove the extracellular toxins?
Chlorine at the end of the treatment process is capable of removing extracellular microcystins, but one of the things that we're really in this whole treatment optimization, when you think about optimizing a treatment plan, the key is to do everything you can to minimize the release of extracellular toxins and to remove as many of the toxin-containing cells as absolutely possible through your coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation process, and through your filters, so that you're not actually depending on the chlorine as the last line of defense.
Okay, and two more questions here dealing with treatment specifically. Can you treat at night to improve settlability? Sorry, I had it. Yes, of a bloom, yes.
Of bloom material. To the best of my knowledge, the settlability of cyanobacterial cells, I do not know if there is a diurnal variation in the settlability of cyanobacterial cells. That being said, if you are optimizing your treatment facility to maximize the coagulation, flocculation, sedimentation efficiency, then the best thing to do is to run at as close to a steady state situation as possible, and that in turn implies that you want to be, if possible, running your treatment facility 24/7.
Okay, and one more. Are there any definite advantages to changing water levels at the intake?
Yes, because depending on, it's site-specific, but depending on the depth of your source water, cyanobacterial biomass can change its position in the water column. And so if you have the capability to abstract water from different depths, that can definitely be an advantage. And that, once again, points to the necessity to have a regular monitoring program in your source water, not just at the surface, but also at different depths.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Heather, I'm going to ask you a couple questions here related to the case studies in your presentation.
Sure.
Okay. There was one, it says in the second case study, algicide application was used. How do you monitor for algicide in finished water samples?
If you're using a copper-based compound, then copper monitoring is required as part of our requirements for algicide application. But if most of the other products, like a hydrogen peroxide-based product, you would not see any algicide degradation products that would be an issue for treatment.
Okay. All right, this is probably, and a couple of these are either of you could answer. So I'm going to say, did you find a correlation between phosphorus, nitrogen, and cyanobacteria?
I'll start. We have not in our work observed a direct correlation, but the literature in that the literature for that is huge, and I think ultimately it's a site-specific thing. And if you have the capability to analyze for nitrogen and phosphorus in your source water and for toxins, we recommend doing it. And it's possible that for your particular situation, there may be a correlation.
Did you have anything to add? Okay.
Sure. I would agree with Nick. There are some triggers. If you look in like the Water Quality Research Australia guidance, there's some cutoffs. If phosphorus is above X, you're going to be more or less likely to see cyanobacteria blooms on your reservoir. So there's enough data out there that people are starting to make some of those correlations. There's also a lot of good research out on the potential impact of nitrogen on not necessarily cyanobacteria biomass, but on the toxin concentrations and the triggers for that, especially with microcystis blooms. So again, I think there's value in collecting the data and assessing whether or not it's particularly beneficial for your reservoir. If you have the ability to selectively pump, I would think it's especially important, because if you can selectively pump when nutrient conditions are low, that's only going to help you.
Okay, Heather, I'm going to ask you a question. It's specifically related to Ohio, and it's asking, someone wants to know if Ohio is implementing nutrient source water protection to help prevent HABs.
Sure. We recently, several years ago, started listing impairments due to algae, looking at the nutrient impacts from that. So we do have, through our Clean Water Act side, a partnership to list impairments and trigger TMDL development and associated nutrient reduction efforts at HAB-impacted drinking water sources. And our source water protection staff are working with HAB-affected source waters specifically on nutrient reduction starting. They've been doing that for a while, but really focusing this year on trying to work with them on reservoir management strategies and understanding nutrient impacts. So yes, that's something we're definitely looking at this from the source, not just from treatment perspective.
Okay, thanks, Heather. This question is for Nick. Why use algicides in reservoirs if the point is to prevent the release of toxins before the plant? Aren't there better algal control or algae cell removal methods?
So the best practice, the recommended best practice for algicide application is, so the way the algicides work is, let's take copper sulfate. What the copper sulfate does is it inhibits one of the things it does is it inhibits the ability of a cyanobacterial cell to reproduce itself. And so the recommended best practice for copper sulfate application is to actually apply the algicide before before the cell counts get too high.
And I would agree with that. We also, in the second case study that folks can read through, we discussed if you have multiple reservoirs, you could obviously isolate a reservoir and apply the algicide, and before that reservoir might affect downstream reservoirs. So that was a successfully used approach in the case study that was listed. Also, for the saxitoxin case study that I mentioned, in this instance, all of the saxitoxins were extracellular. So this is partially why we're having a trouble optimizing treatment for removal, and we kept having consistent finished water detections, was because the toxin concentrations coming into the plant were 100% extracellular. They were not bound to the cell. So we had to find the source of that, which was these benthic organisms, and then we targeted treatment there.
Okay, thanks for adding to that, Heather. And I also, before I move on, we only have time for a couple more questions, but I did want to add in, I know you had mentioned Ohio's program on source water control, like controlling HABs, but US EPA, there was another question about what research is being done. And US EPA, we do have in our Office of Research and Development a lot of research right now. We have a whole research program, our Safe and Sustainable Water Resources Research Program, that does have quite a bit of research in this area. So what we'll do when we actually have to send out revised slides, so we can send the link as well to our research strategy, which contains all of the work that we're doing in the source water protection area, as well as drinking water treatment. So we'll send that link out to everyone. Okay, and the next question would be for Nick. Nick, what types and doses of PAC are recommended for microcystin removal?
So the dosing side, it's a function of how much, it's site-specific, so it's a function of how much toxin is in solution, and it's also a function of how much other organic materials in the water to compete for absorption sites on the PAC. And in terms of the type of PAC, Heather, correct me if I'm wrong, but the state of Ohio is recommending, is it a wood-based PAC?
Yes, a PAC with a higher mesopore volume for microsystems.
Okay. Okay, we have time for one more question, unfortunately. And again, I apologize that we couldn't get to all your questions, but please feel free to contact any of us with follow-up. So Nick, or Heather, I'll go ahead and let you guys pick the last question here.
Let's go with the one about, there was a question early on that was about, has anyone compared the test methods to something like ATP as a surrogate, which would be a much easier test to complete? And I'm going to work on the assumption that we're talking about the ATP dipsticks that use luciferase luminescence, and yes, ATP is, those methods are fast and they're very simple to do. The issue with the ATP is that other bacteria, not just cyanobacteria, would show up potentially in that test. And so if you're contemplating employing an ATP assay like that, you should also go ahead and employ tests for cyanobacterial toxins and also for some of the more cyanobacteria pigment-specific tests to see how well those things correlate.
Okay, great. Heather, do you have anything to add before we conclude?
No, I agree with Nick.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you both for great presentations, and we had a really good Q&A session. And Heather, again, thank you so much for joining us. We really like to have that collaboration with the state, and we actually have a lot more collaborative presentations and future webinars coming up this year. So thanks again, and thank you all for joining us. And again, feel free to contact any of us with questions.
And I'd just like to apologize to the group for our technical difficulties on our end. If we do this again, it won't be so bad.
Oh, Heather, thanks. I think we recovered well. Everything went great. So thank you so much. Okay, bye, everyone.